Jasmine Crockett voiced the number 246 and then paused. She permitted the figure to resonate in the chamber like a stone plunging into still water, ripples expanding in the silence. That specific number represents the Texans who perished during the February 2021 winter freeze. Some individuals froze within their own beds, while others succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning while attempting to generate heat using generators, car engines, or charcoal grills indoors. An 11-year-old boy, Christian Pineda, died from hypothermia while sleeping in Conroe, Texas. His mother discovered him the following morning. His body was cold. Crockett did not glance toward the witness table at that moment. Instead, she looked down at the documents before her. She then stated 112, which is the initial count from the Central Texas floods of July 2025. This occurred due to flash flooding along the Guadalupe River. 31 of those victims were children and staff members at a summer camp. They received only minutes of warning, merely minutes. Some were asleep when the floodwaters arrived. Now Crockett looked up across the hearing room. Senator Ted Cruz was seated at the witness table, dressed in a charcoal suit. His posture appeared relaxed, and his face was set in an expression of practiced solemnity. It was the look of a politician who had attended numerous funerals and subsequent press conferences, learning exactly which muscles to utilize for each event. Crockett asked, "Senator Cruz, where were you?" Cruz leaned toward his microphone, his voice warm, deliberate, and senatorial. This was the voice of a man accustomed to arguing before the Supreme Court and debating presidential contenders, understanding that the initial 30 seconds of any response established the framework for everything that followed. "Congresswoman, my heart breaks for every family impacted by both of those disasters," Cruz began. "Texas is my home, and when Texans suffer, I feel it personally. In both instances, I collaborated with Governor Abbott's office, coordinated with FEMA, and fought to ensure federal resources were deployed as rapidly as possible. Disaster preparedness and response are among the most solemn responsibilities we hold as elected officials." Crockett interrupted, stating that was not her question. Cruz paused. She clarified that she asked where he was, not what he did afterward. She wanted to know where he was at the exact time it occurred. Cruz's expression remained unchanged. He had faced this query hundreds of times before in various formats, from journalists, opponents, and late-night hosts. He possessed an answer. He always possessed an answer. Regarding the 2021 storm, as has been widely reported, I made the mistake of traveling with my family during what resulted in a catastrophic event, Cruz said. I have acknowledged that error publicly and repeatedly. Crockett responded, "And you returned because you were photographed at the airport." Her voice remained even as she added, "But we will get to that." She made a notation in her notebook. When she looked up again, her expression seemed almost pleasant. "That was a very good answer, Senator. You have always been proficient at answers." The sentence hung in the air. It resembled a compliment, but it was not one. Crockett opened her folder, the same thick type with tabs, flags, and documents arranged in a specific order only she understood that she used in other hearings. She extracted a timeline printed on cardstock. "Let's review February 2021 carefully, Senator, because the details matter." Cruz settled back slightly in his chair. This was well-trodden Cancun territory, ground he had survived before and intended to survive again. The strategy was simple: acknowledge the error, pivot to the response, and move forward. Crockett began the timeline, noting that on February 13, 2021, Winter Storm Uri struck Texas. Temperatures plunged into single digits across the state. The power grid, which Texas intentionally kept independent from the national grid, began to fail. By February 15th, more than 4 million homes and businesses were without electricity. Pipes burst, water systems collapsed, grocery stores were depleted of food, and hospitals operated on backup generators. She turned to the subsequent section of the timeline. On February 16th, a Houston family was discovered dead from carbon monoxide poisoning. They had been operating their car inside the garage for warmth. On February 17th, 11-year-old Christian Pineda froze to death in his bed in Conroe. By this time, the entire state faced a full crisis. Citizens were melting snow for drinking water. Elderly residents in nursing homes were wrapped in blankets because the heating was gone. She looked at Cruz and stated, "And on February 17th, the identical day Christian Pineda froze to death, you and your family boarded a United Airlines flight from Houston to Cancun, Mexico. You checked into the Ritz-Carlton." Cruz nodded slightly, his face still maintaining that practiced contrition. "As I stated, Congresswoman, that was a mistake. Crockett interrupted, noting that his wife, Heidi, had texted friends proposing the trip. The group chat was subsequently leaked to the New York Times. Heidi wrote that their house was freezing using capitalization and suggested leaving town. The Ritz-Carlton was priced at $300 per night. Cruz responded, "My wife and I discussed taking the girls somewhere warm, and in retrospect, you requested a police escort through the airport," Crockett said, looking up from the timeline. While Texans waited in long lines for hours to obtain bottled waters, he asked for law enforcement to bypass security lines. Cruz's jaw tightened, the initial physical indicator that this practiced contrition was costing him effort. That is standard security protocol for... On February 18th, photographs of you pulling a suitcase through George Bush Intercontinental Airport were posted online, Crockett continued. Within hours, those images were everywhere. That same evening, Cruz flew back to Houston. She paused, emphasizing, "one night."
But it's civilities.
He lasted exactly one night at the Ritz-Carlton before the photographs made his stay untenable. Cruz stated, "I realized I needed to be back in Texas." Crockett countered, "You realized you had been caught." Her voice did not rise. It was unnecessary. There is a distinction between realizing you were wrong and realizing you were seen, Senator. If no one had taken that photograph at the airport, how long would you have stayed? Cruz opened his mouth and closed it, a micro-hesitation a trained debater typically eliminates. He recovered quickly, asserting, "I returned because my state needed me." Crockett retorted, "Your state needed you on February 13th. He did not depart until the 17th. That constituted 4 days during which he could have been organizing warming centers, coordinating relief, or utilizing his significant national platform to draw attention to the crisis. Instead, you were packing for the beach." She extracted one more item, a printout of a photograph, but did not hold it up, only describing it. "There is an image that went viral during the storm of your dog Snowflake, I believe." The dog was photographed through the front window of his Houston house, sitting alone in a dwelling with no power, while outside temperatures were in the teens. His family was in Cancun, and the dog was looking out the window. A sound moved through the gallery, not quite laughter and not quite a gasp, but something in between. It was the sound people make when an image is simultaneously absurd and heartbreaking. Even the dog understood that someone should be home. Senator Cruz smiled tightly. This was the smile of a man who has heard a joke at his expense so many times that his face produces the response automatically while his mind is focused elsewhere. "Congresswoman, I have addressed the Cancun trip extensively," Cruz stated. "I acknowledged it was an error, I returned, and I participated in relief efforts. I believe the people of Texas have moved. You blamed your daughters," Crockett interrupted. Cruz's smile vanished. Crockett noted that when he returned, he told reporters, and she quoted, "It was obviously a mistake, and in hindsight I wouldn't have done it." He had said he was trying to be a good dad. He claimed his daughters had asked to take a trip with friends, and he was just chaperoning. She looked at him and said, "Your daughters, Senator." 2 young girls he placed before the cameras as the justification for leaving Texas while people were dying. Cruz responded that was an honest description of how the trip came about. Crockett countered with his wife's leaked group chat to the New York Times. Heidi had texted friends that the house was freezing and suggested the entire family go somewhere warm. She was the one organizing the trip. You knew that, the reporters knew that, and yet you went on television and pointed at your daughters.
Mutt.
Cruz's hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, pulled together in front of him in a self-protective gesture. Crockett stated, "The dynamics of family decisions are..." The dynamics are simple, Senator. A grown man flew to Cancun while his state was in crisis, got caught, and instead of taking responsibility, claimed his children made him do it. Those girls had to go to school and face their classmates after their father told the world the Cancun trip was their fault. She permitted the weight of that statement to settle. Meanwhile, and this is the part that always gets lost, she continued, while you were at the Ritz-Carlton, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez raised $5 million for Texas relief. A Democrat from New York was doing his job. $5 million was raised from her followers and donated to Texas food banks and shelters, while the senior senator from Texas was poolside in Mexico. Cruz opened his mouth to respond, then thought better of it. The comparison to AOC was a trap he had fallen into previously. Any response only served to elevate her and diminish him. So he sat there, jaw tight, waiting for Crockett to move on. She did, but not in the direction he expected. Now, Crockett said, closing that section of her folder and opening the next, let's discuss what you learned from that experience. Cruz straightened up. This was the pivot he had been waiting for, the opportunity to discuss how he had grown. He wanted to talk about returning to Texas and working tirelessly, and how the Cancun trip was a humbling moment that made him a better public servant. I have said publicly and repeatedly that the trip was a mistake, Cruz began. When I returned, I immediately— July 2025, Crockett interrupted. Cruz stopped, 4 years after Cancun. There was flash flooding along the Guadalupe River in central Texas. More than 100 people were dead. 31 of them were children and counselors at a summer camp. The water arrived so rapidly that some were swept away in their sleeping bags. She paused, and the room was very still. Where were you, Senator? Cruz's practiced expression flickered, not much but enough like a television with a momentary signal loss. I was traveling abroad with my family when the flooding began, Cruz stated. As soon as I was informed of the severity. You were in Greece, Crockett said, pulling out a printout. Vacationing again, his second foreign vacation during a Texas disaster. And the day after more than 100 Texans died, including children who drowned in their sleeping bags at a summer camp, he visited the Parthenon in Athens. She set the printout down. Your office told reporters you returned to Texas as fast as humanly possible. But the Parthenon is a tourist destination, Senator. It is not on the way to the airport. It is not something one passes accidentally on the way to a crisis. You chose to visit it the day after children drowned. Cruz's voice hardened slightly. I was not sightseeing while people were, Crockett interrupted, stating, You were photographed at the Parthenon, Senator. Her voice remained flat. While parents in Wimberley and New Braunfels were standing on the banks of the Guadalupe River waiting for divers to find their children's bodies, you were in Athens looking at 2,500-year-old columns. The room absorbed this information. There was no laughter now, no gallery reactions, just silence. There was only the quiet devastation of an image that would never stop being true. Marble columns in Mediterranean sunlight, and somewhere far away, a river giving back its dead. Let me show you the contrast, Senator, because I think it's important. Crockett held up two imaginary photos side by side. 2021, Texas freezes. You go to Cancun. You say it was a mistake. You say you learned. You say it will never happen again. 2025, Texas floods. Children drown. You go to Greece. You visit tourist attractions while bodies are being recovered. She set her hands down. In 2021, people were angry because you left. In 2025, people weren't even surprised. That is worse, Senator. Being caught is embarrassing. Being expected to flee is a verdict. Cruz opened his mouth, and what came out was quieter than anything he had said so far. I love the state of Texas, and I have always— Crockett interrupted again. Where were you, Senator? The same answer as last time. Somewhere nicer, somewhere with better weather, somewhere far enough away that he could pretend for a few hours that the worst day of his constituents' lives wasn't happening. She did not wait for a response, but turned the page. Let me ask you about something you did before the flood, Senator, something you did on purpose. Cruz looked up. This at least was a shift of policy, which was safer ground. He could debate policy all day. Crockett stated, "In the spring of 2025, you utilized your position as chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee to insert language into the reconciliation bill that eliminated $150 million in funding for weather forecasting research." She pulled out the relevant legislative text. Specifically, this was funding designated to accelerate advances and improvements in research, observation systems, modeling, forecasting, and dissemination of information to the public about severe weather events. She looked up. "You represent the state most affected by extreme weather in the entire country: hurricanes, floods, winter storms, tornadoes, wildfires. Texas experiences all of them more often and more severely than almost anywhere else. And you cut funding for the systems that warn people when those disasters are coming." Cruz leaned forward and something shifted in his body language. The contrition was gone. In its place was the Ted Cruz that Washington knew best. The debater, the litigator, the man who had won national championships, arguing positions he may or may not have believed. His voice took on the crisp, slightly condescending tone of a law professor explaining a basic concept to an undergraduate. "Congresswoman, I appreciate the concern, but I'd respectfully suggest you look at the broader context of the reconciliation package. That $150 million was part of a bloated funding request that included duplicative programs across multiple agencies. The National Weather Service's core forecasting operations were fully funded. What was cut was a slush fund for research grants that had no direct connection to 31 children died in a flash flood with minutes of warning." Crockett's voice sliced through his like a wire through clay. "Minutes. Better early warning systems, better flood modeling, better observation infrastructure, and better dissemination to the public might have given those camp counselors an extra hour or an extra 30 minutes. That would have been enough time to wake the children and walk them to higher ground." Cruz continued as though she had not spoken, his debate rhythm carrying him forward on autopilot. "The fiscal reality is that we cannot fund every program that sounds appealing without—" Crockett interrupted again, saying, "You are very good at this, Senator." Her voice had changed. It was quieter now, and the quietness had weight. The budget numbers, the committee process, the legislative jargon. "You can talk about anything for 30 minutes and make it sound reasonable. I've watched you do it for years." It was a genuine skill. She paused. "But 31 children are dead, and you cut the funding that might have warned them. No amount of debate trophies changes that." Cruz's mouth opened, then closed. He had been complimented and gutted in the same breath, and the combination left him momentarily unsure whether to say thank you or object. The gallery noticed. A few people shifted in their seats, the particular shift of people recalibrating who is winning. "Let me put all of this together," Crockett said. "2 disasters, hundreds of dead Texans, including dozens of children. And in both cases, their senator was on vacation in a foreign country. And in between those 2 disasters, that same senator cut funding for the weather systems that could have saved lives." She looked at him. "Is this what fighting for Texas looks like, Senator?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like Texas fights for itself while you fight for overhead bins on international flights." Someone in the gallery made a sound that was trying very hard not to be a laugh. Cruz's eyes went to the gallery for the first time, a quick, involuntary glance, the debater checking the jury. Crockett did not give him time to recover. She was already turning the page. "Senator, I want to shift gears. I have been asking about your record on disasters. Now I want to ask about something else." "I want to ask about you." Cruz's eyes narrowed slightly. Policy was a chessboard where he could see the pieces, anticipate the moves, and control the center. But about you was different territory. About you could go anywhere. "You ran for president in 2016, Crockett said, stating it as a fact, not a question. "You came in second in the Republican primary. You won 11 states. You were, for a time, the most serious challenger to Donald Trump." Cruz nodded cautiously, confirming that was correct. Crockett continued, noting that during that campaign, things got personal between him and Mr. Trump, very personal. She pulled out a stack of printouts, including tweets, transcripts, and video stills. I'd like to read some of the things you said about him, your words, Senator, on the record. She picked up the first page from March 2016. Quote, "This man is a pathological liar. He doesn't know the difference between truth and lies. He lies practically every word that comes out of his mouth." She set it down and picked up the next from March 2016. Quote, "Donald Trump is a narcissist at a level I don't think this country has ever seen." Next, from April 2016, quote, "Donald Trump is utterly immoral. Morality does not exist for him." Next, from May 2016, the day he dropped out of the race, quote, "I'm going to tell you what I really think of Donald Trump. This man is a pathological liar. He doesn't know the difference between truth and lies. The man is utterly immoral. He is a narcissist at a level I don't think this country's ever seen. Donald Trump is a serial philanderer and he boasts about it. The man is a bully." She set the stack down and looked at Cruz. The room was very quiet. "Those are strong words, Senator. Pathological liar, utterly immoral, narcissist, bully. Those aren't policy disagreements. That is a man describing someone he believes is fundamentally unfit." Cruz shifted in his chair, stating that during the heat of a campaign, Crockett interrupted, "I'm not done." She pulled out another page, noting a specific incident during the campaign where Donald Trump retweeted an unflattering photograph of Cruz's wife Heidi, placed side by side with a photo of his own wife. The implication was clear. He also suggested publicly that Cruz's father, Raphael, was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy, a claim so baseless it does not deserve the word allegation. She looked at Cruz. "And you responded? You said, and I'm quoting, 'I don't get angry often, but you mess with my wife, you mess with my kids, that'll do it every time. Donald Trump, you're a sniveling coward. Leave Heidi the hell alone.'" The room was absolutely still. Cruz's face had gone carefully, deliberately blank. It was the look of a man who knows what is coming and has decided that showing no expression is better than showing the wrong one. A sniveling coward. Leave Heidi the hell alone. Those are the words of a man defending his family, Senator, and I respect that. I genuinely do. Crockett paused. And then came the Republican National Convention, July 2016. He was given a primetime speaking slot with the whole country watching. And instead of endorsing Trump, which is what every speaker at a convention is expected to do, he told the audience to vote your conscience. He did not say Trump's name, he did not endorse him, and the crowd booed him. They booed him off the stage. She looked at Cruz and something in her expression softened. "I want to be honest with you, Senator. That was a brave thing to do. Standing in front of your own party, being booed by thousands of people because you wouldn't endorse the man who attacked your wife. For about 5 minutes, you were the man your family could be proud of, the man who drew a line and said, 'I won't cross it.' The softness disappeared. That line lasted about 3 months. October 2016, you endorsed Trump. She let the silence do the work, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. And it wasn't just an endorsement. He didn't just release a statement and move on. He phone banked for him. She pulled out a description of the photo. There is an image. I don't need to show it because everyone in this room has seen it. Of you sitting at a folding table in a strip mall phone bank in Houston. He had a headset on, a script in front of him reading from a card and dialing voters, asking them to support Donald Trump for president. She leaned forward slightly. Think about that image, Senator. The man who called Trump a pathological liar sitting at a plastic table wearing a headset, reading someone else's words, asking strangers to vote for the person who called his wife ugly. That is not endorsing from a distance. That is not holding your nose and voting. That is sitting in a folding chair and performing servitude. Someone in the gallery exhaled sharply. It was a sound that was half disbelief and half recognition, the kind of sound people make when they have known something for years but have never heard it described this precisely. Then 2020, you didn't just endorse Trump again, you led the charge. You were the first senator to announce you would object to the Electoral College certification. You helped create the legal and rhetorical framework for contesting the results. You gave the stolen election narrative the credibility of a Harvard law degree and a former Supreme Court litigator. She paused. And when the mob that narrative inspired broke into this building on January 6th, you were hiding in a supply closet. Cruz's voice came out sharper than he intended. I was escorted by Capitol Police to a secure location, as were all members. Crockett countered. Your opponent, Colin Allred, put it differently. He said Cruz was an architect of the insurrection who was hiding in a supply closet. Architect and coward in the same sentence, though I suppose you'd already been called both. Cruz leaned forward, and for the first time in the hearing, real anger broke through the performance. Congresswoman, I will not sit here and be accused of— Crockett interrupted again. I'm not accusing you of anything, Senator. I'm reading your own record back to you. You called Trump a liar. You endorsed him. You called him immoral. You campaigned for him. You said he attacked your wife. You phone banked for him. You said he was a bully. You led his effort to overturn an election. She shrugged. I didn't create the contradictions. You did. I'm just putting them in chronological order. Cruz sat back, his jaw working, the physical tell of a man whose debate instincts were firing but who could not find the right frame, the right angle, or the right counter. Because there was no counter, there was no frame that made pathological liar and enthusiastic endorser fit in the same sentence. The contradiction was the record, and the record was the man. You know, Senator, there's a quote about you that I think about sometimes, Crockett said. It's from Lindsey Graham, a Republican, your colleague. He said, if you killed Ted Cruz on the floor of the Senate and the trial was in the Senate, nobody would convict you. A shocked ripple moved through the gallery. Cruz's face tightened. That is not a Democrat talking. That is a member of your own party, your own caucus. Crockett did not smile. She noted that former Speaker John Boehner called him Lucifer in the flesh, also a Republican. Al Franken, a Democrat, said, I like Ted Cruz more than most of my colleagues, and I hate Ted Cruz. She set her hands on the desk. I bring this up not to be cruel, though I understand if it sounds that way. I bring it up because it's relevant to what we're discussing. You are, by all accounts, the least liked person in the United States Senate. Democrats can't stand you, Republicans can't stand you, and your own college roommate wrote publicly that he would rather pick someone at random from the phone book than see you as president. Cruz was very still. His face had gone through several stages: anger, then forced calm, then something harder to read. It was the look of a man hearing a truth he has known for 20 years spoken out loud in a room full of cameras. And yet you've survived 12 years in the Senate, a presidential campaign, the Cancun scandal, January 6th. You survive because you're smart, because you're relentless, and because you've made a calculation that being disliked is a fair price for being powerful. She paused. But here's what I want to understand. What's it for? All that intelligence, all that ambition, all those enemies, what have you used it for? A government shutdown that accomplished nothing, an election challenge that ended in a mob, 2 vacations during disasters, a career of being the smartest person in every room and the least trusted person in every building. She leaned back. What's the point, Senator? What's it all for? Cruz's mouth opened, and one could see the machinery engage, the debate response, the practiced pivot, the reframe. I've spent my career fighting for the Constitution for— Crockett interrupted quietly. You've spent your career fighting for Ted Cruz. The Constitution was just the uniform. And then she stated the thing that changed the room's temperature. Her voice dropped to something quieter as she continued. You came back for more. 2024, you endorsed Trump again. You campaigned for him again. You defended him again. After everything he said about your wife, after everything he said about your father, after January 6th, after all of it. She looked at him, not with anger, but with something closer to curiosity. I've been trying to understand, Senator. I really have. And I think I finally do. You didn't forgive Trump. Forgiveness requires the other person to apologize, and Trump never apologized for what he said about Heidi. You didn't move past it. You can't move past something you've never acknowledged. What you did was simpler than that. She paused. You decided your ambition was worth more than your wife's dignity. And you've been living with that math ever since. The room went very, very quiet. It was not hearing room quiet, the managed silence of cameras and protocol, but something deeper. It was the quiet of people who had just heard something true and were sitting with the weight of it. Cruz's expression had changed. The debate mask, the one that had survived everything, every hearing, every interview, every attack from both parties for over a decade, was still in place, but something behind it was moving. It was the way a wall looks fine until you notice the crack running through it. My relationship with my wife, Cruz said carefully, is between me and my wife. Crockett retorted, It was between you and your wife. Then Trump made it public. Then you endorsed him anyway. Then you put your wife on stage next to the man who humiliated her. That's not private anymore, Senator. That is a choice you made in front of the whole country. Crockett gathered her papers, straightened them, and set them aside. When she spoke again, her voice had changed one final time. It was stripped of the prosecutor's edge, the debater's precision, and the legislator's formality. What was left sounded like one person talking to another. Senator Cruz, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Not as a senator, not as a lawyer, not as a debater, but as a father. Cruz went very still. Your daughters are old enough now to read everything you've said and everything you've done. They can find the tweets where Trump attacked their mother. They can read your response, sniveling coward, leave Heidi alone. They can watch the video of you at the Republican convention refusing to endorse him, telling people to vote their conscience. That was a real moment, Senator. People booed you and you stood there anyway. For about 5 minutes, you were the man your daughters could be proud of. She paused. And then they can see what happened next. The endorsement, the phone bank, the rallies, the election objection. Years of service to the man who humiliated their mother in front of the entire country. The crack in the wall was visible now. Cruz's eyes, which had been locked on Crockett with the disciplined focus of a man who had been trained never to break eye contact in an argument, dropped. They went to the table. The Princeton debater, the man who had looked Supreme Court justices in the eye, who had stared down presidential candidates on national television, looked at the table. Crockett points at the C-SPAN camera, its red light steady as a heartbeat, and says, Tell them why. Well, not me. Not this committee. Tell your daughters. They're old enough to watch this. Tell them why their father couldn't stand up for their mother. The request hung in the air like something physical, something you could reach out and touch, something with weight and edges. It wasn't a debate question, it wasn't a policy challenge, and it wasn't something you could counter with precedent or reframe with rhetoric. It was a daughter's question, asked by a stranger because the father had never answered it himself. For 10 seconds, which in a hearing room is an eternity, which on television is a geological age, which in the life of a man being watched by his family is something that can never be taken back, Ted Cruz said nothing. His mouth was open, his jaw was working, and the muscles in his face were engaged in the complex choreography of a man trying to assemble words from a place where no words lived. His eyes, which had been locked on Crockett with the disciplined focus of a man trained never to break eye contact in an argument, had dropped to the table. The Princeton debater, the man who had looked Supreme Court justices in the eye, who had stared down presidential candidates on national television, who had held the Senate floor for 21 hours in a filibuster and never once lost his thread, was looking at the table. This was not the silence of a man thinking. This was the silence of a man reaching for the part of himself that always had an answer, the debater, the litigator, the performer, and finding it gone. Not permanently, it would come back. The machinery was too well built, too deeply wired to stay offline for long. But for 10 seconds the mask was off, and what was underneath was not anger or defiance or even shame. It was nothing. A blank space where a conviction should have been. The empty center of a man who had argued every side of every issue, who had called Trump a liar and then lied for him, who had defended his wife and then betrayed her, who had stood on principle for 5 minutes at a convention and then sold that principle for a decade. and who, after all of that, had nothing left inside that was entirely his own. No position that couldn't be traded, no principle that couldn't be revised, no relationship that couldn't be leveraged. Just ambition and the vast echoing space around it. The gallery didn't make a sound, even the typing had stopped. Everyone was watching a man come apart in a way that was more unsettling than tears or rage. The quiet dissolution of a performance that had been running for so long that no one, including the performer, remembered what was underneath. "My family," Cruz's voice cracked. Not dramatically, not a sob, not a break, just a hairline fracture in the smooth baritone. The vocal equivalent of a stress crack in a load-bearing wall, the kind of crack that tells an engineer the structure has been compromised, even if it's still standing. "My family knows that I love them, and I don't need to." Crockett's voice was almost gentle, and the gentleness was the most devastating thing she'd done all hearing. "Nobody said you don't love them, Senator. Because anger can be fought and contempt can be deflected. But gentleness, real gentleness, offered at the moment of someone's greatest exposure, has no defense. I asked why you couldn't stand up for them. Those are different things. You can love someone and still fail them. You can love your wife and still choose your career over her dignity. You can love your daughters and still use them as an excuse when you get caught running away." She paused, and the room waited. "Which is what you did, all of it. The endorsement, the phone bank, the rallies, the election objection. You chose ambition over your family every time, and your daughters know it, and you know it, and now everyone in this room knows it." Crockett stood up. Her papers were already gathered. She'd been ready to finish for a while now. The question had been ready, loaded, waiting for the right moment. And the right moment had been after Cruz had performed his way through disaster vacations and debate mode deflections and smooth policy pivots. After the gallery had watched him be impressive and articulate and unfailingly polished. After everyone in the room had started to think, maybe he's going to get through this. And then Crockett had asked the one question that polish can't answer. "I have no further questions." The room held its breath, then released it. Not as applause, not as murmuring, but as the collective sound of 100 people simultaneously exhaling something they'd been carrying for a very long time. It was the sound of a truth that had been obvious for years finally being spoken out loud in an official room to the man it was about. Chairman Durbin looked at the Republican side of the dais. "Does the senator from Texas wish to make a closing statement?" For a moment it seemed like Cruz might say yes. The machinery was coming back online. You could see it in the way his posture realigned, the way his chin lifted, the way his hands moved to straighten papers that didn't need straightening. The performer was rebooting, the lights flickering back on behind the eyes. But something was wrong with the reboot. The smile that usually accompanied the recovery, the confident, camera-ready Ted Cruz smile, the one that had graced 1,000 campaign ads and podcast thumbnails, wouldn't come. His mouth tried, the muscles engaged, but the result was something that looked less like a smile and more like a man holding his face together through force of will. "I think my record speaks for itself, Mr. Chairman." From the gallery, barely audible, came the response, "That's the problem." Cruz stood and buttoned his jacket, a small automatic gesture that he'd performed 10,000 times, a piece of muscle memory that required no thought and no feeling. He picked up his papers and nodded to the chairman, a professional, measured nod, the kind exchanged between men who understand that the business of the day is concluded and the next order of business is leaving the room without appearing to flee. He walked toward the door. He walked the way Ted Cruz walked, shoulders back, chin up, the stride of a man who has been in rooms where people hate him for his entire career and who has learned that the walk matters more than the destination. If you look confident, you are confident. If you look unbothered, you are unbothered. The walk is the message. But the walk today was slightly off, not in any way a camera would catch, but the people closest to the aisle, the ones in the first row of the gallery, the staffers standing along the wall, could see it. A tightness in his shoulders that wasn't there at the start, a mechanical quality to the stride as though he were following instructions rather than moving naturally. It was the walk of a man who was thinking very carefully about walking. He didn't look at Crockett, he didn't look at the gallery, he looked at the door and he walked toward it. And when he reached it, he put his hand on the handle and paused for just a moment. The briefest of hesitations, the kind that could mean anything or nothing. And then he was through it, and the door closed behind him with a soft institutional click. In the gallery, two reporters had a quiet exchange. He couldn't say it. Say what? Anything real. That night, the clips would begin their journey, cut, captioned, and distributed across every platform at the speed of outrage and recognition. The opening 246, then silence, then a child's name, then where were you? The Cancun timeline ending with even the dog knew someone should be home. The Parthenon line. While parents were identifying their children's bodies, you were looking at columns. The debate mode dismantling. You're very good at this, Senator, said in a way that made skill sound like a disease. The quote collage, pathological liar, sniveling coward, leave Heidi alone, followed by October 2016, you endorsed him. The phone bank description, sitting at a folding table wearing a headset, calling voters on behalf of the man who called your wife ugly. And the one that would last longer than all the others, the one that would be shared until it wore grooves in the internet, not because it was the loudest or the cleverest, but because it was the truest. Tell your daughters why their father couldn't stand up for their mother. And then the silence. 10 seconds of Ted Cruz, Princeton debater, Harvard law, Supreme Court litigator, the man who always has something to say, with his mouth open and no words coming out. The silence that said everything his career never would. But Crockett wasn't watching clips. She wasn't thinking about virality or news cycles or the fundraising emails that would quote this hearing for the next 3 election cycles. She was thinking about Heidi Cruz. Not the public Heidi, the one who stood on stages and smiled at rallies for the man who mocked her. Not the political spouse who had learned, as all political spouses learn, to arrange her face for cameras and keep her reactions inside. The private one, the one who on some night in 2016 watched her husband call Trump a sniveling coward on national television and thought for one fierce, proud moment, there he is. The man she married. The man she moved across the country for. The man who would fight for her when it mattered. And then watch that same man, 5 months later, sit at a folding table in a strip mall phone bank and dial numbers for the person who humiliated her, because the math said it was necessary. Because the path to the White House ran through Trump's good graces, and good graces cost what they cost. And what they cost in this case was his wife's dignity. What does that do to a marriage? Not the political calculation of it, but the human cost. What does it feel like to stand next to your husband at a rally for the man who called you ugly and smile because the cameras are rolling and the brand requires it? What does it feel like to watch your husband become year by year the thing he told you he'd never become? And the daughters who are old enough now, who can Google, who can find in seconds every tweet, every photo, every clip, the unflattering photo of their mother next to another woman posted by the man their father now works for, their father's voice saying sniveling coward and leave Heidi alone. And then the phone bank photo, and then the endorsement, and then the rallies, and then years of service, of loyalty, of silence to the person who did that to their mother. What will they think? What have they already thought? These are questions Crockett couldn't answer and wouldn't try to. They were private questions for a private family, and the hearing had pressed against them only because Cruz himself had made his family public, had put them on campaign stages, had used them as excuses for Cancun, had built a political persona around family values while systematically trading his family's dignity for political advancement. Crockett knew this Ted Cruz would recover. He always recovered. He'd go on his podcast tonight and frame the hearing as a partisan attack, as a Democratic stunt, as an attempt to silence conservative voices. He'd have an explanation. He always had an explanation for everything, always. The machinery would reboot, the mask would go back on, and the performance would resume. By morning, he'd be tweeting something combative. By next week, he'd be on a stage somewhere talking about fighting for Texas, fighting for families, fighting for values. his voice strong and his eye contact impeccable, and his conviction indistinguishable from his ambition. Because at this point in his career, the two were the same thing. And that was the saddest part. Not that he'd been exposed. Powerful men survive exposure all the time, and Ted Cruz was nothing if not a survivor. But that the exposure wouldn't change anything, because Ted Cruz wasn't a man who made mistakes. He was a man who made calculations. Cancun was a calculation that went wrong. Endorsing Trump was a calculation that went right. Greece was a calculation that went wrong again because he hadn't updated his algorithm after Cancun. And the daughters and Heidi and the phone bank and the supply closet, all of it was math. Cold, clean, professional math performed by a man who had replaced his convictions with algorithms so long ago that he'd forgotten the substitution had occurred. The hearing hadn't revealed a scandal, it had revealed an absence. The empty space where a person's center should be, the part that decides what can't be traded, what won't be sold, what you'll defend even if it costs you everything. Every person has that part, or should. The line they won't cross, the thing they won't sell, the family they won't betray. Cruz had never found that part, or maybe he'd found it once for 5 minutes at the Republican National Convention in July 2016 when he told a booing crowd to vote your conscience and walked off that stage as the only person in the building who had said something real. For 5 minutes, the machinery had stopped. For 5 minutes, there was a person behind the performance, and then the math took over, and the person went back into the supply closet where he'd been hiding ever since. Crockett pushed open the door and stepped into the hallway. The cameras were waiting, the questions were waiting, and the news cycle was already turning, already processing, already deciding which 10 seconds of this hearing would represent the whole thing. She knew which 10 seconds it would be, the same 10 seconds everyone in the room would remember. Not the Cancun timeline, not the Parthenon, not the weather funding or the phone bank photo or any of the policy points that would be discussed and debated and forgotten within a week, just the silence. 10 seconds of Ted Cruz, Princeton debater, Harvard Law, Supreme Court litigator, the man who always has something to say, with his mouth open and his eyes on the table and no words coming out. Because someone had asked him to explain to his daughters why he couldn't stand up for their mother, and he couldn't. Not because the answer was complicated, but because the answer was simple, and the simple answer was unbearable. I wanted to be president more than I wanted to protect her. He'd never say it. He'd never have to. The silence said it for him. The weather outside was warm. It usually was in Washington in summer, until it wasn't. And somewhere in Texas, it was always hurricane season. What happens when the smartest man in the room has no convictions? What happens when the best debater in Washington can't answer the simplest question? What happens when a man sells his family's dignity for a political future and someone finally asks for the receipt? We just watched it happen. He'll recover, he always does. He'll have an explanation, he always has an explanation. By tonight, the podcast will be recorded. By tomorrow, the tweet will be composed. By next week, the fundraising email will go out, turning this hearing into evidence of persecution, turning the silence into someone else's fault. But somewhere, 2 girls are old enough to watch the clip, and they'll see their father, the Princeton debater, the Harvard lawyer, the senator who fights everyone, sit there with his mouth open and no words coming out. Because someone asked him why he couldn't fight for their mother. He'll fight anyone. He'll fight Democrats. He'll fight his own party. He'll shut down the entire government and hold the Senate floor for 21 hours straight. He'll take on the President of the United States and call him a pathological liar to his face, and then he'll endorse him and phone bank for him and lead his election challenge and smile next to him at rallies. Because the math requires it, because the path requires it, because the ambition requires it. The only person he won't fight is the one who hurt his family, because that fight doesn't lead anywhere he wants to go, and now everyone knows.